Right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sian Smith. I'm here with Gemma Taylor, QC, and George Butler. We're all family law barristers at 42 Bedford Row. And also here, Dr. Ben Lasky, a chartered psychologist. We're very pleased to welcome you all this evening to the first in our series of remote family law seminars. Thank you all very much for coming along. The programme for this afternoon will be the talk by George and Dr. Lasky on the psychology of care proceedings, emotional harm and the interim removal of children in care proceedings. So a fascinating topic. After the talk, which will be about 20 minutes, we'll have some time for questions. So if you do have any questions for Ben and George as you're listening to the talk, or afterwards, please feel free to click on the bottom of your screen to the Q&A section and type your questions in there. And then Gemma and I will try to put all, if not all, some of your questions to Ben and George at the end of their talk. So just lastly, before I hand over to George, I just want to let you know that you're all on mute. Don't be alarmed. And just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded so that we can make it available via Chambers' YouTube channel after today. So thank you very much, George. I'll let you take it away.
Hello, and thank you for joining 42 Bedford Row in this, the first of a series of remote seminars where we'll be looking at a number of aspects of family law. My name is George Butler. I've been practicing as a barrister in family law for the past 16 years. And I'm very pleased to be joined in this seminar today by Dr. Ben Lasky. Ben Lasky is a chartered psychologist who reports in family cases in the southwest of England. He's been undertaking expert reports for over 10 years, and the last year alone he's completed 26 assessments with impacts on 52 children. Ben is here to talk to me about the psychology of care proceedings, and in particular emotional harm and the interim removal of children. Ben, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, George.
I was going to start simply with a statement of the law as it currently stands, most recently in the case of Re-C, and the statement that a plan for immediate separation of a child should only be sanctioned by the court where the child's physical safety and emotional or psychological welfare demands it. Sorry, I should have said or emotional or psychological welfare demands it. I don't want to change the law. And where the length and likely consequences of the separation are a proportionate response to the risk that would arise if it didn't occur. Ben, what do you understand by a child's psychological welfare?
I suppose that when I'm thinking about psychological welfare, I tend to think of the kind of indices of parenting that are laid out in the attachment theory literature. So issues around parents' availability and responsiveness to a child, the ability of the parent to create a feeling of safety and trust for the child, the parents' stability and consistency, so the child knowing within reasonable limits what they will expect the parent's response to be in a given situation, and then thinking about the parent's ability to attune and be sensitive to a child's emotional presentation and accept the child's emotional state, whether that's kind of an easy to accept or more challenging emotional response. And I suppose if you take those things together, we're talking about a parent's ability to be present as a good enough secure base to that child. And then I suppose the other thing to think of is that within that, one kind of needs to hold in mind that different children will have quite differing levels of resilience to varying levels of parental competence. So some children will be able to tolerate a far more, if you like, chaotic or dysregulated style of parenting than other children who might have a need for something much more defined and predictable.
Another way the law states it is to say that a child's safety requires immediate separation, and of course that safety is also their psychological welfare. What constitutes an immediate risk to a child's psychological or emotional welfare?
I think that's quite a difficult area. I mean, in practice, my experience, certainly in the family courts, is that we would rarely see, certainly coming for psychological assessment, we'd rarely see children where there is a threat to the psychological welfare in absence of other indices of abuse being present.
Well, some of the things I can certainly say from experience in the family court is that where a child is removed on the basis of psychological or emotional harm, it's normally because they're repeatedly witnessing, say, domestic abuse, and the abuser isn't leaving or is going back, or they're being repeatedly bullied or scapegoated, and there's something obviously cruel, and the child is being singled out for abuse. But courts have been remarkably relaxed, I find, in shouting at children, smacking them, ignoring them, failures to put boundaries in place, or being overly strict or coercive. Can you draw a distinction between what is immediately harmful to a child's psychological welfare and something that's more chronic?
I think that the kind of situations where you might think there was an immediate risk or an acute risk might be a situation where a parent's acutely struggling with their mental health. So you might have a parent who, under ordinary circumstances, is able to do a good enough job of meeting the child's needs, but perhaps present with periods where they reliably struggle with their emotional functioning. And during those periods, they might present as alarming or confrontationary, or they have impaired reality testing, so they might struggle to make good enough appraisals of what the child's kind of intentions are. So I've certainly known parents who appeared to experience their children as though they were persecutory adults rather than dependent, young humans with a very kind of, a need to be held and tolerated, whatever they bring. Does that answer?
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me, and certainly parents who have a mental health breakdown who are sectioned or presenting as very florid often have children separated from them. Would you include parents with an emotionally unstable personality disorder in that umbrella definition?
I find the personality disorder labels a little bit, sometimes a little bit problematic. We've moved now under ICD-11. There's a new category of complex PTSD, and my reading of that new category is that most parents who previously would have been labelled with the EUPD or borderline personality disorder will now fall under, or at least potentially fall under, the category of complex PTSD, which I think is a more helpful understanding of that presentation, in that it includes within it a kind of account of the fact that these are parents often have an enormous amount of trauma, and it then presents more of a kind of route map for how you support people, if that makes sense. But obviously parents who present as highly reactive and sometimes alarming and confrontational, certainly can be very difficult for a young child to make helpful sense of. And then I suppose the question, in a way, the specific diagnostic category is less helpful in predicting harm to a child than the idiosyncratic presentation of that parent. And then the other thing I would say is that even in parents who might have a chronically relapsing kind of mental health diagnosis, where they really struggle to be parenting effectively during periods where they're acutely unwell, there may be a more helpful model of saying, actually, we may have to put something in place to increase the safety during these periods, but there's nothing to say that that parent can't do an excellent job when they're less well. So there's possibly grounds for some form of either interim elevated support or interim separation, but I would be worried if that were taken as a kind of one-way street. Does that?
Yeah, one of the things I find is local authorities will often complete a comprehensive parenting assessment at the start of proceedings, and they'll come to court with a care plan that says that this child or these children need to be removed immediately because their emotional welfare is compromised. And they will often use the language of attachment. So they'll talk about a child developing or having already developed an anxious or an avoidant or disorganized attachment. First of all, you mentioned attachment, the language of attachment right at the start. Is this the sort of language that's of any help in determining what a child is actually being exposed to?
I suppose what I think is that attachment behaviours from a child can give quite a good clue as to the style of parenting broadly that they've been exposed to. But again, the difficult thing is if you've got a parent whose functioning is quite variable, you may see a child who displays some quite disturbed behaviours in response to specific parental reactions, but who at other times may have, perhaps which they found particularly difficult to manage emotionally, but who at other times, can respond in a much more kind of calm and measured way. And I suppose one of the things that feels important to me is that when we read the kind of headline concerns of professionals in a bundle, we tend to see the peaks when things have gone very badly wrong in families, but we tend not to have good documentation of when parents are doing a good job. So we don't see those. We don't see documented in the bundle, the peaceful Friday evenings where families are at home watching a film together, or where a child has, got ready for school and dropped off appropriately by a parent who's able to manage those transitions. So does that make sense? The kind of almost the lens that's looked through tends to pick up on problems, and so in terms of thinking about separation, one of my concerns often is that we miss the strengths that a parent might have, even against the background of some acknowledged and serious difficulties sometimes.
Well, the fact is that the timetable for proceedings is 6 months, and so when you're looking at an interim removal, what you're really looking at, if you're trying to argue removal, indeed argue that children should stay with their parents, is what is the likely nature of this drip, drip, drip of inadequate parenting on their psychological welfare? Is the time scale significant to you? Are there some kids you think you could identify and say, absolutely not, 6 more months of this, and this child's attachments are going to be all over the place? Or is it not as simple as that?
I think probably making those calls is very difficult. I suppose what I would think is there may be cases where you could argue it more strongly. So if you've got, for example, older siblings who've been through the same family system, and there's very little evidence of parents engaging in the support that's being offered, and you can show particularly problematic outcomes for those older children, you could say, look, absent parents engaging in a parenting intervention or in some attachment supporting work, or being able to actually take on and apply parenting advice, you might say, look, actually, we're not likely to see the same outcome being repeated in this family. Having said that, again, the issue of different children having different levels of natural resilience based on their kind of, temperamental characteristics, that's, it's quite difficult to make completely confident conclusions based on that. In a way, you're looking at, it's kind of how workable a parent is, really. And I suppose my general starting point would be to say, actually, we should do everything we can to intervene with these parents, even if previous attempts have been unsuccessful, rather than instigating removal to an unknown new care setting. And this is one of the key issues at the moment that we're certainly, in my work recently, my experience is that placements are pretty thin on the ground, and the idea of matching effectively a child to a placement that can really meet their needs in a very tailored way at the moment seems as though it's rarely possible. And so that would make me, even more cautious than I would in any way be to recommend a separation of a child from their parents, because the risk of a child being placed into a setting which actually fails to meet their needs in important ways, when there's already obviously a risk of separating a child from their parents, it's something I think we need to be extremely cautious about.
Is there the emotional equivalent of discovering, for example, that a child's got a healed fracture from a suspected non-accidental injury? So can you say that if a child's got a history of emotional trauma, there's an emotional equivalent for an old broken limb?
Okay, I see. So I don't know that there is. I mean, obviously in I want to say compensation law, if that's really not the right term, medico-legal terms, as the idea of the eggshell skull. So you could say, okay, this person already had a pre-existing vulnerability. And I suppose what you're suggesting is that if you have a child who spent their whole life in a family who appears to be presenting with a pre-existing vulnerability, that would be attributable to the
pretty much
to the parenting. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because the reality is, it's very hard at a single. Essentially, a psychological assessment will provide you with a snapshot of how that child presents today, or in the months or weeks where that assessment's undertaken. But it's very hard from that to unpick the relative influence of temperament or biological vulnerabilities, developmental, maybe a developmental disorder that's been undiagnosed, or a learning difficulty that's not been picked up, the impact of parenting which has failed to meet the child's needs, and whether or not there's been a specific either single case or repeated trauma the child's been exposed to that's not been disclosed. In a way, you kind of, although sometimes what happens, I mean, certainly I've had experience where working with children who've been separated from families, a specific trauma might subsequently be disclosed. But if it's not been picked up on or isn't identified, it might take years for example, a discrete episode of sexual abuse that hasn't been noticed by a family might not come out to the child's in their teens or even into adulthood.
Well,
I think that you can't really, with confidence, say, okay, with this child's presentation, in absence of other information, definitively shows that they've been, as you're saying, the equivalent of a mended broken limb. I think it's slightly shaky ground.
I think I'm obviously trying to get you to say, well, I know 5 separate scenarios where obviously you'd remove this child for emotional harm, and I think what you're saying to me is it's not nearly so simple. Mr. Justice Headley has a famous quote in the case of Riel, which we all trot out when we've got chronic neglect cases and we don't want children to move away. So society must be willing to tolerate very diverse standards of parenting, including the eccentric, the barely adequate, and the inconsistent. What's your fear of the harm that happens to children if you get them out of a chronically difficult situation too quickly? Because you seem to be very much coming down the side of don't remove unless you really have to. What's your fear for the children if you do? Well, I mean, I think that if you look at the evidence on close call separations, just quite somewhat disturbingly, what you tend to see is that the children who are maintained in the home environment do have slightly better outcomes than the children who are removed to what's supposedly a better care environment. So, and obviously you could say, well, that's because the ones who are maintained are being cared for slightly better, but actually the evidence, it tries to look at, comparable cases where that leads to a kind of broad metric. You're looking at similar cases where the judgment call has gone one side or another of the line. And I think we have to remember that removal in itself inevitably creates damage. And that even removal with reunification is going to cause some difficulty if, say, the court were to remove on an interim basis and then the final hearing say, actually, we think we may have acted too hastily, we should return the child to the parent's care. So I just, I know that in law it's very clear that removal is the last-ditch effort when everything else has been exhausted, and that seems to me to be an entirely sensible principle. Do you think that when you're looking at the presentation of a parent who you might be wanting to assess, there's a difference between a parent, say, with a learning difficulty who may have a chronic problem in giving their child what they need, and parents with more florid emotional presentations, complex PTSD, or ones who are simply bad at parenting but don't have learning difficulties. Is that a significant factor?
I suppose generally speaking, the evidence is that with good support, even with significant disadvantages, whether that's a mental health issue or a learning disability, people can do a good enough job of parenting. The question really is looking at the characteristics of a parent, their level of motivation, their ability to engage in support and engage in perhaps any therapy they may need themselves. It's more those individual characteristics of the parent that are predictive in my experience. One of the things that we often look at in psychological assessments is whether someone has had what can be called a light bulb moment, where they've suddenly thought to themselves, oh, okay, this really hasn't been okay for my child.
Are those actually a thing? I mean, we talk about them in court all the time. Your Honour, we've arrived here. This is the last chance saloon. My client has seen the light. From a psychological perspective, assessing parents, do they actually happen?
Yeah, I would say they're reasonably rare. I think actually the reality for all of us is that the moments in which we look at our life and think, good God, I really need to make some changes, are fairly few and far between, and generally require a certain amount of robustness to be able to be honest, for any of us to be able to be honest with ourselves about where we are in our life in that kind of a way that requires significant and perhaps painful changes. But certainly it's something that I have come across with parents where I've had parents present it as though it was bona fide, and in cases where I've had some doubt about that. But I've also had parents present it in a way that's felt like it's got some genuine weight behind it.
Ben, I could talk to you all afternoon, but that probably takes us as far as we should go. I'm tempted to wrap it up by saying that you largely believe that the law has got it right, and that you shouldn't be separating children unless you can justify it by a very, very high standard, particularly at an interim stage. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that seems.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair summary of my position, George. The way I would put that.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. If these go well, we may do another one on this area of psychology and care proceedings. Thank you very much.
Nice talking to you, George.
That was a wonderful, informative discussion. Thank you so much to George and Dr. Ben Lasky for your presentation. We'd certainly like to hear further discussions from you in the future on all aspects of psychology and care proceedings. It will be so helpful to us. Having watched this talk, I know many of you will have questions because these issues are so challenging and pertinent to our cases. And this is an area about which lawyers have so much to learn. So please send in any questions you have now. Don't be shy about it. We're going to try and field, and Sian and I will sort out your questions and put them to mostly Dr. Lasky, no disrespect, George. But if I could start with a question that I had. It's two-part, I'm afraid, Dr. Lasky, having seen this talk. Dr. Lasky, you talked about the resilience of children and how this explains why some might be less vulnerable than others to the effects of emotional harm. This might not apply to small infants, and it's something I wanted to ask you about. Is there an age or stage in a child's life when they have not developed such resilience and have an even greater need for consistent, reliable, emotional parenting? That's part one, so sort of age. And part two is, what are the risks and consequences for very small children if they don't receive this level of consistent, emotionally healthy parenting?
I suppose there's kind of a number of ways to answer that question, if you like. So one would be to say that generally speaking, younger children are more vulnerable than older children. So if you've had 5 years of pretty good care and then things for one reason or another in the family go off the rails somewhat, then there'd be a certain kind of base built up, if you like, from the positive care experiences. So in some ways you'd say, well, later disadvantage is less problematic than early disadvantage, assuming you get good quality care early on. But having said that, you know, children are amazingly resilient also. So actually, you know, there's a brilliant capacity to recover if the care within a family can be supported and brought up to a good level. I mean, there are specific maturational points around attachment. So, for example, there are certain structures that emerge. For example, around 10 months, you see children start to express anxiety around strangers, which is it's almost, you know, it's kind of a developmentally normal progression. So, broadly speaking, exposing a very young infant to a very chaotic, frightening environment is going to be more damaging than exposing an older child to that. Having said that, there are also differences in resilience from birth. So there's the researcher is a guy called Tom Boyce, Professor Tom Boyce, and he's kind of the kind of phrase he uses to distinguish children who are more naturally resilient is the distinction between dandelion children and orchid children, which is a kind of idea that, you know, a dandelion will grow pretty well more or less anywhere, whereas an orchid needs a specific set of very specific kind of care experiences to achieve its full potential. And so you do see children who, you know, emerge apparently unscathed from a kind of care environment that their siblings seem to be hugely traumatized from. Does that feel like it answers?
It does.
Question? Good.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Ben. I'm going to ask you another question, but it's still on the topic of resilience. I think Gemma and I were having some similar thoughts, but where you've got differences between what you described as dandelion and orchid children, is there a point when it becomes possible to understand what the resilience is of a particular child, or even to predict which children may be more or less susceptible to poor emotional care?
Yeah, I mean, there's resilience is a kind of, as I say, new. That's probably showing my age. It's a newer area of psychology. We've tended to focus, you know, for most of the existence of psychology as a discipline on pathology rather than health. But I suppose over the last 15 years or so, resilience has emerged more and more as a kind of domain to study, and there are some quite clear indices of resistance. Resilience. So we look at things like children with an average or above average IQ tend to have better resilience. Children who have so even if you've got a very problematic care environment, for example, you have one positive relationship with an adult in your life, that could be a teacher or an uncle or a grandparent, that can be hugely protective. And there are a number of other kind of issues, you know, some of them are around, so for example, if you are a girl and you hit puberty early, that's a kind of marker for risk. Whereas if you're a boy and you hit puberty early, that's a marker for resilience, because those boys who kind of, you know, get a bit bigger and a bit more kind of social, that tends to give them a social advantage, whereas it will give, you know, girls who hit puberty earlier and become more, you know, obviously kind of feminine, you know, physically feminine, actually at somewhat more risk, I suppose, of negative experience associated with that. So that, I mean, so there is a literature around that which helps to kind of pull that apart quite well. And then I suppose the other thing is, as we were kind of talking about, you know, very young infants, there are, so one of the kind of key indices when you're looking at the kind of characteristics of newborns is that you can look at things like reactivity and behavioural inhibition. So reactivity is how, so some babies are really quite relaxed even in a kind of home environment where there's loud noises or, you know, unexpected things going on. They seem less reactive to that, so they're a bit more able to kind of sail through. And but behavioural inhibition is a kind of early marker for shyness and social anxiety. So again, that's something that you can measure in children even from, you know, very, very early days post birth, and that will give you a kind of sign, okay, this child may be, you know, slightly at risk for anxiety or resilient in those kind of ways. Does that Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting. Really interesting. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you to participants for sending these questions in. So I'm sorry about the random nature of what you're going to be hit with now, Dr. Lasky.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
This is from an anonymous admirer. It's how important is it for a psychologist to undertake a psychological assessment of both parent and child in order to identify the damage that may have been caused to the child? I guess that's with a view to just understanding whether it's important to observe interactions and talk to the parent as well as assessing a child.
I mean, I've worked professionally within the NHS. Most of my work has been, it's been within child and adolescent mental health services, and I think that. What do I think? I think personally, I do assessments of parents, just a single parent within a family system where there might also be questions about the other parent, but where I'm not asked to assess the other parent. I do assessments where I'm asked just to see a child, sometimes when there are other children in the family, but it's just one child who's raised concerns. Sometimes I'm asked to see a whole family where there are several children and both parents, and sometimes parents' partners as well. And I suppose that those are quite, from a professional point of view, those are quite different pieces of work. Generally speaking, the more individuals one sees within a family, the more complete a picture one has. But you can, it's not problematic to have an assessment of just one parent if the questions are focused sufficiently around what that parent's bringing. And similarly, I've certainly been happy, if you've spent a long time working with children, it's possible, based on how children will present and how they'll interact with you, to have a pretty good idea of what they've been through in bits of their lives. I mean, I suppose that where you might run into problems with an assessment of just one individual in a system is if you've got a professional doing that assessment who doesn't have a very kind of broad base within a kind of child wellbeing, child mental health context. Does that would be my feeling.
Forgive me, I may have put the wrong emphasis on the question. I think the question was, how important was it to assess both a parent or both parents and the child when undertaking a
Yes, no, I did understand that. I suppose what I'm saying is I think actually, generally speaking, it doesn't strike me as problematic to do an assessment of a single individual within a family. And I think that you tend to get a more complete picture when you're assessing if you're asked to assess everyone within a family system. But the reality is, there has to be often a choice about, well, where do we feel that there's kind of confusion or a particular need. So if I'm asked just to see a child, often it's thinking, okay, what does this child need support-wise to make things around them function well? And to do that, I wouldn't particularly feel it was necessary to see a parent. But then if the question is more, how do we support the relationship between this child and this parent, it would be very hard to answer that question without having the chance to see the parent and child together. So in a way, it depends on what question there is to be answered, rather than being able to kind of give a catch-all response to that. Does that
yes,
feel
that's
like it
very
more
clear.
clear?
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take another from our question list. This one's from Oliver Conway, and the question is, what in your view are the long-term emotional effects of a removal at birth of a baby from their mother? So this is going back to what you were talking to with George towards the beginning of your talk, I think.
It's interesting. I suppose those are cases that I haven't been involved myself professionally in those cases, because those tend not to involve, we tend to not, as psychologists within the family court system, we tend to not come into contact with people who are at the further end of that process, if that makes sense. So children who are removed at birth, that may be on the basis of a mother or parents saying that they know they can't parent, or an unfavourable kind of judgment by the court on parents' capacity at that point to provide care. And I think that historically there was kind of an idea that if one was adopted at birth, the birth family effectively became your forever family, and that you were, in fact, even not very many years ago, it wasn't particularly assumed that adoptive parents would even share with their children that they were adopted, although that's thankfully, thankfully that's not the field we're in now. The other thing is, obviously now with social media, Facebook and things like that, it's very easy for people to track down their biological families in a way that didn't used to be possible. And so that what actually tends to happen now, I think, is that people are in touch with biological families much earlier than they would have been historically. And my suspicion is that has both positive and negative sides to it. That channel is more open to people. I think, in a way, I feel like I'm giving the same answer to many of your questions, which is that I suppose it depends very heavily on someone's journey through their adoptive life growing up. That a child who feels very strongly a sense of belonging and acceptance and is parented, very lovingly and effectively, removed at birth, is probably likely to have better outcomes than the child removed later. Certainly the evidence on adoption is that the later an adoption happens, the more problematic it's likely to be in terms of outcomes. Does that, yeah. I feel like I might have rambled slightly away from your question, Sharon.
No, not at all. And I was just wondering, I think it sort of falls in, doesn't it, with what you were talking about earlier about the right placement for the right child, the right care for the right child, and that presumably would be just as applicable to a child growing up from birth as a child removed at a later date, although their needs might be different.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's much harder to determine a child's specific needs if they're removed at birth than it is if they're removed, say, 6 months in or a year in. But what you also might, I think, quite reasonably suggest is that a child who is removed, very early from parental care, even if those parents really, very much know they're not in a position to care, the reality is the child will be shielded from difficulties they might otherwise be exposed to that would trigger removal at a later point. So one of the things I think that is really important is almost a kind of dose effect of trauma, if that makes sense.
Yes, really interesting. We've got quite a few more questions, but I think we've probably only got another 5 minutes or so of the session, but we'll pick out the best ones. Gemma, you're...
Okay, this is the next one. Okay, this is from our own Helen Nettleship. I feel like a DJ. What work can be done with young children to grow their resilience rather than removing them from a difficult home? And what age?
I suppose that I have a kind of very, very rough rule of thumb, which comes from my CAMS work, which is that essentially if you've got preschool and primary age children, your most effective way of intervening is with the parents. So with the age of parents the age of children you're talking about, I'd be looking from a professional point of view, intervening. How do we support parents? And that may be around some very basic kind of social work jobs of how do we actually get things more stable, make sure that their house is clean enough, make sure that they've got access to electricity, hot running water, decent food, some of those kind of just the basics for life. But then if we're talking from a more kind of technical psychological point of view, what I'd be looking at is what are the things that we can do to strengthen the attachment bonds. And one of the interventions which has had really promising outcome data in the last sort of 5 to 10 years is video interaction guidance, where you're working with a parent and a child, and it actually works for across the age range, but particularly good with young kids, where you're basically helping the parent to see how nicely the child responds to certain things that they're doing, and that's been shown to be really good for promoting attachment. And then also often parenting groups, so the Solihull, Incredible Years, Triple P, those groups are all very good at supporting parents to feel less alone and to develop skills that they might need to support children more effectively and consistently.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just looking through the questions, and there's one that piqued my interest because it might be helpful to everyone, which is whether there's any entry-level books or on psychology that you might recommend to lawyers that would help us to expand our understanding of the issues, particularly in relation to attachment and removal. I think attachment theory is something that a lot of lawyers think we know about, but maybe not.
Well, there are some books, like, having that. So there's a lady called Joyce Scaife, which is Scaife. I can't remember off the top of my head the title of her book, but it's called something like Children in the Family Courts. Or I'll just see if I can Google it without too much interruption to what I'm saying. And then increasingly, there are a number of psychologists who've released books on kind of introductory books on attachment. So there's a lady called Miriam Silver, and I can't remember the name of her organisation. Sorry, and I also can't find this book. But a lady called Miriam Silver, who's published a couple of kind of easy introductions to attachment, and I feel as though I'm not completely certain. Sorry, Miriam, I'm not completely certain. I think she's done one for parents / adoptive or foster parents, and I think she's done one for kind of non-psychology professionals. And then those are kind of really easy to read. I mean, if you want a very basic guide, Wikipedia is a pretty good go-to for just the kind of overall overview on attachment classifications and things like that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think everyone will be able to find some, if not all, of those books.
I'm sure we can put those books on the. If we're putting this up somewhere, I can find those books and pass them across to you, so we can put them up with a link to this or something.
Yes, thank you very much.
No problem.
Have we got time for one more question?
I think we do. Gemma, go on, one more.
Great, okay. Okay. Right, this is Dr. Lasky, this comes from Anne, is Dr. Lasky an advocate of the view that domestic violence between parents while the child is in the womb will affect that child's psychological presentation as he grows older, causing him or her to be of an aggressive nature? Interesting. Sorry, you've got 2 minutes to answer that.
Okay, so I think that there is some quite interesting literature. There's a lady called Vivette Glover who did quite a lot of work on in utero stress. So you're looking at mothers' cortisol levels during pregnancy and predicting children's behaviours. And her research broadly showed that you could predict children's behaviour problems in their early teens based on the level of stress a mother was under during pregnancy, which is, as a psychologist, quite a disturbing finding. Makes you think that perhaps we're wasting our time. Having said that, if you look at the small print in her research, what you see is that for children who had positive attachment outcomes, though that's those kind of early, the early disadvantage what's the word I'm after? The early disadvantage conferred by in utero exposure to high levels of cortisol became non-significant. So actually, what the kind of evidence is, certainly, exposure to stress, including domestic violence, during pregnancy is really a bad thing for very young children, and it can have measurable long-term outcomes. But the kind of positive message is that for parents who are well supported and well resourced, those kind of nurture experiences can hugely mitigate and as far as the evidence appears to show, kind of wipe out that early disadvantage, if that makes sense. And again, as we were saying earlier, Gemma, when you were asking about what about disadvantage for children who are exposed to trauma early, it's really important that actually we do remember that children can recover from situations that seem almost unrecoverable, and all of us can learn new ways of understanding and interacting with the world. Even some of us in our 40s and 50s. So I always hold on to a bit of hope that we can all change.
Right, I think probably that's the point at which I have to step in and say thank you, Sian and Gemma, for fielding the questions that we've had today. We've had a whole bunch of questions. More than 100 people have joined us on this Zoom, so thank you all for taking the time and the opportunity to listen to Ben. If you're interested in this particular area and you want to know one of the ways the court deals with particularly emotional harm, you could do a lot worse than go back and look at the case of Ree B. This was from 2009, EWCA Civ 12454. That was a case where a 6-year-old boy was essentially locked in his room, bullied, treated incredibly badly, and the court made an interim care order in respect of him. But his 2-year-old daughter was treated much better. The supervision order was made in case of her, and the Court of Appeal didn't like that. And said, no, in those circumstances, you have to look at the nature of the abuse and see how that impacts on the emotional development of the younger child as well. So that's one example of the way the court deals specifically with this issue. We are repeating these seminars. Wednesday, the 27th of May, sees the seminar on child contact centres in lockdown and beyond. Very interesting. Anne Dillon, a barrister and mediator and vice chair of the National Association for Child Contact Centres, and Elizabeth Coe, the chief executive of the National Association for Child Contact Centres, discussed the ways in which centres are keeping children in touch with their families now under the lockdown provisions, and the work being done to expand contact services in what is the new normal. So that's got a very big interest value for all of us practitioners. But I'd finally like to thank Dr. Ben Lasky for taking the time to talk to me earlier and answer your questions now. Ben, thank you very much for joining us all today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for your questions. It's been really interesting.
Thank you, everybody else, for joining 42 Bedford Row. Look out for other seminars coming in this series in the future.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.